Assalamu alaikum. I'm Marwa Mohkam Sheikh. Welcome to Narramus. In December 1954, the CIA and US Air Force started a highly secret project called Project CHALICE. Until the late 1960s, and even after that, this program was considered one of the country's most closely guarded secrets. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on this little-known chapter of American spy history. CHALICE involved the overflights of Soviet Union and satellite states by a manned aircraft known as the U-2 for the purpose of collecting photographic and electronic intelligence. U-2 planes were single-engine jets which were capable of maintaining a stable flight for periods up to 10 hours at 70,000 feet, with a range of approximately 2,000 miles. To expose this operational aircraft to the general public, a necessary cover was devised. U-2 planes were introduced as NASA's, then called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, project, to conduct upper atmospheric research studies. What was the purpose of such clandestine reconnaissance missions? In the 1950s, there was a growing missile gap controversy, which had its roots in a series of dramatic Soviet announcements during late 1957. The Soviet Union in August 1957 did its first successful test of ICBMs, and in October of the same year, it sent Sputnik into space. 1 month later, the Soviets orbited a second satellite containing a dog and a television camera. To many influential Americans and Congress members, this seemed to indicate that the Soviet missile program was ahead of that of the US. On 9 December 1958, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev asserted that they have an ICBM capability of carrying a 5 megaton nuclear warhead 8,000 miles. To monitor these developments, the US came up with U-2 spying missions. The US had developed U-2s, but President Eisenhower was reluctant to authorize the flights over to the Soviet bloc. He preferred using satellite for reconnaissance. But the problem was the US satellite program wasn't ready for up to 2 years. Declassified CIA reports show that Eisenhower remained worried by the terrible propaganda impact that would be occasioned if the plane were to fail. In June 1959, President Eisenhower finally authorized electronic intelligence collection missions along the Soviet-Iranian border, called Operation Hotshot. And on 9th July, the same year, the US also operationalized Badaber airbase in Peshawar. A U-2 equipped with 8 cameras left Peshawar, Pakistan, flew over Ural, and then crossed the missile range at Tiratam. This mission, the first one from Pakistan, known as Operation Touchdown, produced excellent results. While this overflight was underway, another U-2 flew a diversionary mission along the Soviet-Iranian border. Despite its success, this overflight remained an isolated incident. The Soviet premier visit was scheduled for 15 to 17 September 1959, and Eisenhower was unwilling to authorize additional overflights. Diplomatically constrained, the US, however, encouraged the British to join them in these overflights of the Soviet Union. On 6 December 1959, the Royal Air Force also joined the US overflight mission called Operation Highwire. Squadron leader Robert Robinson left Peshawar and overflew Kuibyshev, Saratov Engels airfield, and the Kapustin Yar missile test range before landing at Adana, Turkey. The mission photography was again remarkable. The CIA until then was unable to get some evidence of SS-6 ICBM deployment outside Tiratam missile test range. To find that out, on 5 February 1960, a U-2 plane with British pilot squadron leader John MacArthur left Peshawar to conduct Operation Knife Edge. The plane overflew the Tiratam missile test range, headed northwest to Kazan, and then turned south, photographing long stretches of the Soviet rail network. The mission did not reveal a single missile site. Nevertheless, the search continued. In mid-February, Eisenhower, seeing the success of the British missions along with the absence of Soviet protests, reconsidered authorizing the Air Force Soviet overflights. He authorized 4 flights, but not before 30th March 1960 because of some complications in getting permission from Pakistan to use the airfield at Peshawar. The US resumed U-2 overflights, Operation Square Deal, from Peshawar on 9 April 1960. And as had been the case during the previous 2 flights, a second U-2 flew a diversionary mission along the Soviet-Iranian border. The flight plan of the mission, according to the declassified documents, shows to be quite a zigzag path. It's important to note here that this was the time the American intelligence cautioned the project managers that the greatest threat to the U-2 was the Soviet SAM, with high probability of successful interception at 70,000 feet, provided that detection was made in sufficient time to alert the site. The latest intelligence input made Badaber Peshawar airbase the Americans' favorite. Penetration from the Pakistan-Afghanistan area offered the greatest chance of escaping detection by the Soviet air defense system. During this period, the US also flew U-2 reconnaissance flights from other bases like at Tula, Greenland, Atsugi Air Base, Japan, and Adana in Turkey. As mentioned before, Peshawar had become the most suitable location to conduct such flights. Till then, all previous missions had penetrated not more than halfway and then left in the general direction from which they came. The CIA wanted to fly across the Soviet Union from south to north, departing from Peshawar and land at Bodo, Norway. The mission would overfly Tyuratam, Sverdlovsk, Kirov, Kotlas, Severodvinsk, and Murmansk. It was the most adventurous overflight mission to date, named Operation Grand Slam. President Eisenhower had allowed the project one additional operation, provided it was carried out prior to May 1st, because the Paris summit was scheduled to begin on 16th May 1960. The CIA planned to execute Operation Grand Slam. The pilot selected for the operation was Francis Gray Powers, the most experienced U-2 pilot in the program. He had joined the project in May 1956 and flown 27 operational missions in the U-2. To prevent the U-2 from being seen at Peshawar, the project manager decided to fly the aircraft from Turkey to Pakistan a night before the scheduled flight. Once the plane was refueled and its camera was loaded, it would take off at daybreak, with little, if any, exposure to local residents. Powers started his takeoff on 1st May 1960. Once airborne, Powers signaled the operations unit in Peshawar that everything aboard the aircraft was okay. Aside from this simple signal, Powers and all U-2 pilots maintained strict radio silence during penetration missions. However, the May Day turned out to be a bad time to overfly the Soviet Union. On this major holiday, there was much less Soviet military air traffic than usual, so Soviet radars could easily identify and track Powers' U-2. In addition, the Soviets responded to the intrusion by ordering a ban on civilian air traffic in a large portion of the Soviet Union. The Soviet radar began tracking the U-2 when it was still 15 miles south of the Soviet-Afghan border. When Powers reached the Tashkent area, as many as 13 Soviet interceptor aircraft scrambled to intercept his plane. 4.5 hours into the mission, an SA-2 SAM detonated close to and just behind the aircraft and disabled it 70,500 feet above Sverdlovsk. It crashed before the pilot could arm the destruction device. Powers was arrested by the Soviets immediately as his parachute hit the ground. The crash was a huge embarrassment for the Americans. Allen Dulles, Director CIA, offered to take responsibility for the overflight and resign. During the Paris summit, the Soviets demanded an apology from President Eisenhower. In reply, he did announce a suspension of the overflight but refused to make a formal apology. The crisis dashed all hopes of President Eisenhower's visit to the USSR. Consequent to this accident, Detachment B of the Project CHALICE at Badaber, Peshawar was aborted. It remained active for 44 months. Both US and British pilots carried out 24 overflights from there. Closing down of Detachment B marked the end of the British's direct involvement in U-2 operational overflights. Pilots from different detachments were consolidated into Detachment G at Edwards Air Base, California. The CIA rebranded Project CHALICE as Project Idealist and continued surveillance for a few more years. As regards Operation Grand Slam pilot Powers, the Soviet court sentenced him to 10 years. After his return to the US, he was reinstated in the US Air Force and on retirement worked for Lockheed as a U-2 pilot. He died in August 1977 while flying his helicopter. What are your views on the subject? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, Allah Hafiz.